So welcome everybody to this week's seminar. And before I introduce today's speaker, I have to pass on the apologies of Elena Isayev, who, my co-organiser, isn't here today because of the quirkiness of university timetable. She's actually giving her own inaugural lecture, hundreds of miles away in Exeter at the moment. But maybe before we speak, we could give a little clap to congratulate Elena on her inaugural. Very pleased to welcome Julia Hillner, Professor of Medieval History at the University of Sheffield. Julia, I think, is known to many here. She has degrees from Bonn and Perugia and Padua, and for most of this century she's actually been in Manchester or then moved over the Pennines to Sheffield and has had positions on AHRB project, for those of us who remember AHRB, British Academy postdoc and other things. But in Sheffield has been leading a sort of a wonderful southward advance of medieval history into the antique, through the late antique, which is really delightful to know about, and yeah, very good news indeed. Among other things, she is the PI of two different projects. Are they both running at the moment, or?
No, Clerical exile has actually finished. Yeah, although
And then Women and Conflict is about to start.
Yeah, it has started.
It has started, and also author of Prison, Punishment, and Penance in Late Antiquity, and a whole series of other works which are perused around justice, punishment, order, gender across late antiquity. Really, really pleased you're here to talk to us. Many of us are just starting work on migration and things. You've finished this project already, so looking forward very much to hearing what you have to say on it. Welcome.
Thank you. That was very nice. Thanks. Okay, so I'm presenting on Clerical Exile, which was this HSE project that I led from 2014 to 2017, which actually has led to another project now funded by the Leverhulme Trust, which I'm also going to talk about a little bit, because the two, even though they don't look as if they hang together, they actually do. Okay, so with Clerical Exile, in late antiquity, I don't know how far you're familiar with that, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of clerics, mostly bishops but not only, were banished, mainly due to religious conflict, but not only. Some were also banished because of other, running into the course of justice in some other way. Anyway, exile becomes the major way how to deal with troublesome clerics over this period. So what we did in this project was to collect the data on banished clerics, and banishment or exile we actually did define as banishment proper, which is the outcome of a legal process, or as escape from prosecution. So the framework of justice was always there. This is how we define exile as a judicial phenomenon. And in the project, we collected data on clerics leaving, at the time of leaving, the legal circumstances, to the time of death or return of cleric exile, plus potential saints' cults, which happened, and importantly, data on locations that cleric exiles visited, and most importantly, data on all the people they interacted with during the time of their exile. Really kind of the time from when a legal process was started, or a danger of a legal process was kind of on the horizon, to the end of exile, either through death or return, or just losing the cleric in somewhere in space because we don't know anything about him. And our main aim was to understand the effect of a clerical exile on late antiquity, as it were. So one of the main questions we thought we wanted to ask was whether the exile had the effect that authorities intended. So, for example, whether it actually shut down a particular source of influence, whether it isolated exile clerics, whether it humiliated them. So all these kind of strategies that authorities were exiling emperors or councils, church councils were having in mind. So if this didn't happen, what effect did it have? So this was our main question. And because a lot of exile was generated by theological dispute, I worked with this on this with two theologians, and their interest was obviously in dissemination of ideas and doctrine and so on, or not. Whether exile actually had an effect of shutting down routes of communication. So what we thought we would do was to construct a database, which we did, which is now online, open access. If you are networked, then this is our database URL. We also have a project website. The database is kind of fully there, but it's not very decorative because somehow our IT support doesn't seem to be able to put some pictures in these kind of. They have done an amazing work on actually visualizing our data. I will show you in a moment what they've been doing, but this seems to kind of stall, and this is like a mini thing. So I don't really know what's happened there. So there should be kind of pictures in these gray areas, but that's about it. What's still missing. Okay, so that if you don't know whether the rooms network, but you can have a look at it. We also have a project website. Eventually, this should also be integrated with each other. These two sites. So it's a database that is kind of prosopographical, but that's not entirely correct because the database is constructed around exile cases. So if one cleric had more than one exile case, such as, for example, John Chrysostom, who had two, will appear twice in the database, or will be counted twice as an exile case. Now, with the database, we are in a position to analyze the phenomenon spatially and statistically, so you can visualize all the places connected with clerical exile on a map, and then explore these places further, and you can visualize the data as a tabular format and so on. I mean, you can have a look, but because we wanted to investigate the effect of exile, or the impact, this is also why we included not just exile clerics, but all other people that they were in contact with. All of that just cries out for methods of network analysis, which was one of the reasons I think we actually did get the funding, because we said we would do that in 2014. This was still quite. Nowadays, I think in 10 years' time, every historian will be a network analyst, because it's just emerging as this major tool, a bit problematic. I'm going to talk about that as well. So what's network analysis, in case you don't know? Okay, we can visualize networks. I'll show you in a minute. Okay, so you want to look at whether ideas, practices, or types of behavior were, how they were disseminated. You go to this method, because network analysis, it's not quite clear whether it's a theory or actually a method, but there is some theoretical thinking behind it, because it postulates that ideas and behaviors are created through social interaction, and particularly social interaction which happens outside the box. So there's this concept of homophily. So people, usually connect with people who are like themselves. That doesn't generate any new ideas. But if people kind of have to go outside those social circles, then there's the potential that kind of new ideas can float. And of course, with clerical exile, that is what happens, because these exiled clerics were taken out of their comfort zones and usually ended up somewhere else. So that's quite an interesting approach then to use. Now, networks are often invoked metaphorically in historical studies, and very rarely interrogated analytically. We assume influence because someone was in contact with someone else. But in our project, we actually had enough data to do some proper mathematical analysis, which kind of did help us to some extent to uncover some unexpected influences and some unexpected ways how ideas and influences traveled. And I should say, because this is sometimes not quite understood, I think, is that network analysis just looks at any contact and not just conscious network building, which isn't, some people do that, but a lot of people don't. But we all have networks, whether we use them or we don't use them. And network analysis the theory does postulate that we're still influenced by whoever we're connected to, even though we might not kind of network strategically. So that's important to remember. And hence we wanted to look at everyone. But actually what you have to do with network analysis is you have to distinguish between certain types of connections. So whether networks are connected through conflict or through friendship or through kinship, for example, so the quality of relationships is quite important. So just as a flavor of what you can actually do with our data, this is well, first of all, it does help you. Network analysis helps you to visualize your data in a very striking way. That is well known, but I still think this is striking. These are all our social relationships connected, all the connected clerics in our database, so all our 500 exile cases, as one global network graph. This covers about 300 years, which is interesting in the way that you see that even though it covers 300 years, people are still quite connected over these 300 years, and this is also because we have connected exile clerics with their successors, for example, and sometimes, as I'm going to say in a moment, their companions come back to their place of origin and become their successors, and so on. So you actually, there are these genealogies built through clerical exile, which then can kind of accrue to 300 years, for example. Now, some of these areas are clustered, as you can see, and if we kind of zoom in, so for example, this is John Chrysostom, who was exiled at the beginning of the 5th century. These are, I'm going to talk more about these. These are exiled clerics exiled under Constantius II, so about mid-4th century. A very, very interesting network. This one is clerics exiled under Justinian. So there are these moments of clerical exile where we have a lot of data that obviously influence how the kind of global network is clustered, as it were. Now, you can look at such clusters as communities. Coming to the topic of my talk. And a community is a fuzzy concept. It implies a group of people who share some things, such, for example, space, or the same values, or some identity attributes, or all of these, only some of these. But in network analysis, communities are detected, or these clusters are detected just by whether people were in contact with each other. So purely through social contact, which you obviously have to define in certain ways. So that's why it's really, really important to keep track of the quality of your relationships. And in fact, the algorithms underlying the clustering in network analysis are called community detector algorithms. And there are several of them, and they will, depending on which one you choose, will show you different things because the mathematics underlying them are different. And this is only something that I kind of understood very much at the end of the project when I started to talk to mathematicians, which I hadn't because you don't necessarily talk to mathematicians, and I can't come across them. I don't. But then I actually met my current collaborator, Maureen McCarran, who I'm going to mention later. And she was actually in touch with mathematicians who are now integral to this new Leave a Hume project, and they've actually told me that, for example, Jeffy is not a commercial, open access network program on the internet, uses this one community detector algorithm, which might actually not show what you want it to show. You really have to understand the mathematics. So they actually advised me against Jeffy. Which is interesting. I don't quite understand why. I have to talk further about them, but it's quite interesting that mathematicians think about community in a very different way than we might. Okay, I'll come back to that later on as well. Okay, so the biggest benefit for us in Clerical Exile, the Clerical Exile project, was that if you read a text for mining a text for just people and connecting people with each other, then you start seeing people you don't usually see, and that's it has been quite amazing. Now this is obviously important as well, not just because we begin to understand whether Clerical Exile disseminated ideas, but you begin to see exile as a community event. That affected communities. Now, Clerical Exile is very good about talking about exile as a lonely experience and experience of isolation. So John Chrysostom, who already mentioned, does that a lot in his letters, but he's not the only one. And actually, late antique laws sometimes decree loneliness of people. So, for example, there's a law on Jovinian, who's a designated heretic at the end of the 4th century, and sends him to this island, so to live with peasants and so on, who don't count as people, but it's a lonely experience. So it's about isolation. But obviously, there are peasants there, which didn't seem to kind of register with the lawmakers, but when they go into our database, obviously as connected somehow. So that is important. But then there's different social relationships that the Clerical Exiles had tell us different things about their social worlds. It's really important to keep a track of them. And what we actually did in the database was to distinguish between quality of relationship and quality of interaction. So interaction is whether you visit someone or you give them food or correspondent and so on. But obviously these interactions can be hostile or friendly. Not every visitor is friendly or every visitor is hostile. So you have to distinguish between them, and in our database you can actually bring up different networks according to quality of interaction, quality of relationship. But type of interaction is also important to understand different types of communities. Because, for example, we want to distinguish between companions, visitors, and correspondents. So people that Clerical Exiles took with them, as opposed to who they may have met, or who they kept in contact with, long distance, or even back home. Now, these are 3 different types of communities: a moving one, a new one, and one that stayed behind. If all correspondents were back at home, but they're all part of the same exile clerics network. So in a way, a network is then can be even visualized a journey. In terms of leaving community behind, taking one with cleric, and finding a new one. Right, just to show you one, or just to show you an example of what we've been doing. So this is a text that we've been reading, and we didn't do any distant reading, so we did all reading by hand. And I should say that this hasn't been done by me, but by my research associate Dirk Roman and some interns, Louis Dagnall and Harry Maudsley, who was a PhD student. So the data that are in the database are their work. and that is important. And if you want to cite the database, there is a citation guide on our website, and obviously you should mention all these names. Okay, right. So a text like this can actually be visualized like this in our database. So what happened here was that Bishop Mare was exiled to the city of Petra, and he took with him Shmuni and Nonna, and also Isidore, the Bishop of Krenetrin, and then they spent 7 years in exile. They were exiled under the Emperor Justin, so this is around 520. 520, and then Justinian comes to the throne, his nephew, and his wife Theodora does actually petition, or takes a petition from some of Mare's companions that he is moved to Alexandria, which is a more pleasant place than Petra, apparently. And then so they move to Alexandria, they end their lives in Alexandria, and then Mare ends their life in Alexandria, and then the two women, not in this text that was just on the screen, but in another text, take his bones back to Amida, where he was bishop before. And this is really kind of interesting in terms of companions. It's quite difficult, I found, with our data to grasp the community that stayed behind. Very rarely mentioned in our text, and I think that is kind of symptomatic, as it were. The left behind are either not interested in those who left, or those who write about cleric exile are not interested in what they actually left behind. But we have very concrete information about companions, including their names, and the significance of the companions has really come out in our kind of research through this, because the companions are often the messengers of letters. So even if a bishop writes back home, it's usually a companion who takes the letter back home. So it becomes this intermediary between communities. And then also later on, companions sometimes go back and become successors in the place. Peter the Fourth, yes. Peter the Fourth, in the 6th century, Bishop of Alexandria, was in exile with Theodosius of Alexandria, who actually moved, according to our text, with 300 clerics. And this is, I think when you start thinking about the numbers, even if you don't think the 300 are a real number, Mare takes with him 5 people, some other 10. This kind of all builds up, as it were, and the impact that these people had when they arrived in their place of exile must have been quite significant. So we were interested in companions. I personally am quite interested in women because for Mare, 2 of his companions are deaconesses, Shmuni and Nonna, and they also take back the relics afterwards, his bones, to Amida. And why were they moving with Mare? Now, I think what happened was also that, and it hasn't really been looked at before, is when a bishop was exiled, what happened to his clerics? Could they really stay behind? Because usually then there would be a successor in post who would be of the favorable faith and would probably bring in his own people. So with the companions, they were not exiled, but they were also not moving voluntarily. They were moving because they were vulnerable. And this is particularly clear for the women who were moving with exiled bishops. So that was interesting to find out as well. Thinking about dependence. And then companions also, well, I did already say that, connected the exiled cleric to new communities. They often assist the bishops in their liturgical ceremonies, they nurse them, they find food, they act as secretaries, and so on. And obviously then afterwards take back the relics. And you do wonder, why are they actually mentioned in our sources? Now, I would think they are mentioned because the problem for exiled bishops was that they obviously didn't accept that they were deposed. So they had to show that they were still bishops. And having a following was really important for them, but then also for people writing about them, particularly if they wrote hagiographies. So this kind of having a community was really important. We don't see that so much earlier in the period, in the 4th century, but you really see the emergence of companions and having a community for these bishops in later texts, such as particularly in Syriac hagiography that we've just been looking at here. Okay, so I come back to women in clerical exile in a moment as well, but just to show you how many we've actually found and the variety of things they did. Some of them were exiled themselves as well. Yeah, there's collateral damage. The bishop is exiled, and then the virgins in the city. This happens to Athanasius of Alexandria in the 4th century. His virgin, whatever relationship he had to them, they're exiled. As well, so it was really something that affected a lot of people and a lot of communities. Okay, so another thing you can do with the database, then showing these people as network graphs, is to map clerical exile, as I've already mentioned, according to certain attributes which you can find here. So whether something was a departure location or an exile destination, location of arrival, and so on, and the size of the nodes shows, the importance of that location in terms of clerical exile over the period. So, Rome is very important. Alexandria and Constantinople, that isn't probably so surprising. In this period, these were kind of the big patriarchal sees, where a lot of bishops were exiled from or came to. And a lot of the theological conflict was going on. But when you drill down, which you can do with our map, so you can go to time slices, I thought that was quite an interesting exercise to do, because I thought, okay, this time slice is very small time slice between 325 to 380. What are the places that are really important? And actually you find out that a lot of exile destinations are quite close to each other, which is really strange. Why, exile all these people to Egypt, or why exile all these people to Palestine? And that seems stupid, because they might talk to each other. So, in terms of kind of creating spatial communities. And I think that was quite surprising. So what's going on here? And I do think that, and this comes more from my previous thinking about crime and punishment, that authorities, these were emperors or bishops' assemblies, weren't so interested in what happened afterwards. They were interested in expulsion. And to get kind of the troublemaker, out of this kind of theatre of action, and the choice of place often depended on what people thought was the quality of life offered in the place. So, sending someone to the desert of Egypt, made a big signal. Not really thinking about that there were cities in the desert of Egypt where people could actually get together. But it was about the symbolic kind of sending someone to the desert or to the margins of the empire. In the case of Palestine, this is actually outspoken in our sources. To send exile clerics to live with Jews. An abhorrent idea for these Christian bishops. In the earlier Roman Empire, this might have worked out, because in the earlier Roman empires, usually aristocrats were exiled from Rome. And that was a big impact on their life, because Rome was their seat of action, and obviously, it's where they derive their political power from. But with clerics, this didn't work so well because they're often provincially based to start with, and also had network structures that existed independently from the Roman secular ones. So Christian bishops had actually quite good ways of being in connection with each other, and some bishops would proselytize, which senatorial aristocrats didn't. They didn't have anything to proselytize for. But we do see, mainly in hagiography, but not necessarily. We do see these bishops starting to build up followings in their places of exile, and there are some passages of Edessa, for example, in the 4th century. He's moved 4 times, and he's moved first to an island whose name I now forgot, off the Syrian coast, where he really assembled a community, which afterwards kept his bed for pilgrims, so they could come and look at this bed of this moved out bishop, because he was then moved to Egypt and progressively to more restricted environments. So he ends up in a fortress, dies in a fortress, because he was building up communities. So that's interesting. But I also thought it particularly interesting is when these exile clerics were close together. So coming back to network analysis, what you can do is factoring in space into these networks. So this is a 4th century exile scenario. So what happened in 355? Athanasius of Alexandria, who was the bishop of Alexandria, was condemned at the council in Milan. He wasn't actually at the council, but there were lots of bishops who liked Athanasius and didn't accept his condemnation. And these bishops were all Western. One was from Rome, one was from Vercelli, one was from Milan, and one was from Poitiers, and they were all sent to the east. And they are on the right-hand side of this network. And on the left-hand side are the bishops in Egypt, who were all expelled because they supported Athanasius, and they were all sent into the desert. The Thebaid, actually all over, but some of them were in kind of is it Upper Egypt? Okay, and so Liberius and Eusebius and Lucifer, he's also one, they're actually 5. So they're all sent to the east, and they actually also moved around because they start building up communities and so on. But Eusebius and Lucifer also end up in the Thebaid desert, and who knows? Out of this whole scenario, definitely comes Eusebius does return to Italy, and he's a big fan of Athanasius, and others say, I think Hillner does say, I would have never known about anything that Athanasius was actually talking about. I just liked him, but then when I went to the east, I read all his stuff and came across all these people and so on. So something really happened here, but it's also quite intriguing to think that these people did meet in the desert, because they were probably not in the desert, but they were in those urban communities in the Thebaid. So we can kind of at least postulate about that. And also, if you separate these networks, then these look really isolated, these bishops in Egypt, while they all look very, very connected to each other. This is probably, I'll come to that, probably just reflects our source material, because we have the letters of these guys, these Western guys. But if you factor in space, you can speculate that they weren't as isolated as this makes out. So I think that we can show that clerical exile probably disseminated ideas on a large scale, but sometimes we actually can name people. And everything I've just shown you, apart from the last slide, it wasn't real network analysis. Because network analysis, the mathematical network analysis measures degrees of centrality. That's what it's called. So who was the most connected, who was the best connected, and so on. Unfortunately, in the database, you can't do that because my IT support was fantastic and put all of this together, but they aren't, well, supposedly network analysts. And building in all these algorithms was just, something we couldn't do technically. So I've been doing this in my spare time, and I'm using exile, which is a network analysis software that you find on the web. You actually have to subscribe to it, but my university does subscribe to it. You actually have unlike Jeffy, I don't understand Jeffy, but unlike Jeffy, you can have a choice between different community algorithm detectors. So you can actually see which, how the network looks differently, whichever you choose. Okay, so just to explain this slide to you, this is Eusebius of Vercelli, who I've just mentioned as one of the Western bishops exiled after the Council of Milan in 355. He was first sent to Chrysostom in Palestine, and then ran into problems with the local bishop there because he was actually trying to take over the community. He was moved to the Upper Thebaid, and then he was recalled in 362 under Julian's general amnesty, and he went first to Alexandria, where he attended a synod organized by Athanasius, so probably making kind of capitalizing on his contacts that he made in the desert. Then he took the synod's decision to Antioch, so he actually didn't return immediately to the west, but toured a little bit the east. He meddled with a schism in Antioch, and then he returned to Vercelli in 370. He returned to Vercelli, then he died in 371. I fed all the data of his relationships into Excel, which allowed me to visualize them in this way, and also to make a few calculations. So what you want to look at with a network graph, in case you don't know this, is how big it is, how dense, how interconnected, how fragmented, how centralized around a few actors. Are there cohesive subgroups or communities in the network sense? But if you look at it like this, there are... there are these communities. These are the people in Scythopolis. These are the people in Vercelli. These are people that are somehow connected to this guy Evagrius, who I come back to, and these are bishops. And interestingly, both Eastern and Western bishops. So, all these people have something in common. I didn't say to the software what they had in common. The software just, put them together on the basis of their connections, which is like magic. If you're interested, it's the Vakita Surumi detection community algorithm, but yeah. So that's interesting that the software did that, and it, some of this was pretty obvious, some of which wasn't necessarily. So particularly this group, I thought was quite interesting, and actually it is more interesting than you think, because if you look at who's the best connected person in this network, so the person who, not necessarily the one who has the most connections, but the one who has the best connections to everyone else. So who sits between the groups. And it's actually called between the centrality. It's unsurprisingly Eusebius himself, but he's shortly followed by someone who I didn't have on my radar at all, which is Evagrius. And Evagrius is a really interesting person, came from a curial family in Antioch, had been educated by Libanius probably. He held imperial posts, he was disgracefully dismissed, and then he became a priest. And he became a priest around the time that Eusebius was in Antioch on his way back from the desert. And then, even better, Evagrius accompanied Eusebius to Italy. And then in Italy, he picked up a host of new contacts, such as the Bishop of Rome and Jerome. And he also interfered with the case of an adulterous woman. But the most important thing is that he translated the life of Antony into Latin while he was in Italy. And that's probably well known. A life of Antony did generate a whole new host of interest in asceticism in the West. Vargas then returned to the East. He also meddled in the schism in Antioch. He hosted Jerome. He might have taught John Chrysostom an ascetic practice, and then he became Bishop of Antioch in 388. So he's by far the more interesting person than Eusebius himself, but importantly, he was not exiled. And he has these really interesting connections to an imperial group. So this one is partly imperial, partly just Eastern Antioch, Eastern based, partly actually connected to education, but he also has these links to Western bishops, Jerome and so on, and obviously to Eusebius himself. He is what network analysts say an essential weak link, because he connects all these people, and he was probably networking as well. So how much these kind of brokers who are in networks are really kind of there because they're just in the middle and pass on information. And I do think this happens. Probably not so much for Evagrius, who was probably trying to get himself into these groups, which is really interesting because Evagrius was not yet a bishop. He was a bit of a social maverick, but this does confirm what some network analysts say, that networks have the power to cut across institutional structures, and so on. Okay, so at this point, you probably ask yourself, whether any of this is actually sustainable, as it were, as a method, because there are a number of issues with social network analysis, which very kind of quickly can be summarized as our sources are very fragmented. So, do we actually see a full network, or do we see just snapshots? There might be some brokers who we don't know about, who totally eclipse Evagrius. That's really important. Our sources are very polemical or tendentious, usually, particularly on clerical exile. So, are they writing up certain people or writing down others? That's a really difficult question. And then, particularly on network boundaries, where do you stop? We stopped by, clerical exile is this slice of life, all the contacts, during this slice of life, but we didn't actually, because it wasn't part of the project, we didn't have the money, build up the whole network of a person, which you could probably have done, but we didn't. So there are these kind of practical boundaries also to network data. But also, of course, we do assume flow of information on the basis, partly all of this is speculation, right? So they met in the desert is totally speculation, but also in terms of how did Evagrius come to translate the life of Antony? Was it already known in Antioch before Eusebius got there? Did Eusebius give it to Evagrius? Did Evagrius pick it up in Italy? So all of these answers have massive implications on our understanding, for example, of Western asceticism. How did this actually come about? We just assume certain things from this network. But most importantly, what we're seeing here is actually not a network of exile cases. It's a network of the commemoration of exile cases. And that is really, really important. So if someone appears just as a dot on this, we cannot assume that they were socially isolated. We can only assume that no latency author was actually interested in this person and, did not care to write up the social relationships. But I think, and this brings me to my new project, which I want to talk very briefly about, that coming to the end of Clerical Exile, I thought, okay, there's more in this than we have done, and more about these patterns of discourses about exile that we could probably do more about with quantitative analysis. And luckily, in literature studies, people have already, had this thought before me. That you can use network analysis as a tool to understand how authors constructed relationships, which ones they thought were important, how they envisaged roles in relationships, and so on. So in that context, it's the text that creates the boundary of the network. You're only looking at a network described in a text. So it's kind of an emerging field. It postulates that the study how a narrative text describes changes to social relationships over the course of a plot, provides deeper insights into the structural roles of its characters, captures actors' position in an entire social network constructed by a chosen text, and ideally the time dimension inherent in narrative text and the corresponding changes to social relationships. So basically you look at a text, a narrative plot, over time, over narrative time, and see, how the network of characters changes and who becomes more important, who becomes less important, and when, and so on. And one person who has written quite a lot about it is, I actually don't know his first name, Moretti, who you might come across. I'm only mentioning because he's recently run into trouble over sexual harassment. And there's this big debate, well, should you still cite Moretti and so on, or shouldn't you? It's obviously a big figure in literary studies. I am mentioning him because my new project is on it's on women. I'll show you because I don't think I have time to talk about it. So this is my new project on how women are written into stories, late antique stories. And I thought that was quite nice, turn up the Moretti link, because I don't think anyone has ever put network analysis and gender, or the construction of gender together, certainly not in the period that I'm studying. Anyway, let's go back and show you a little bit what you can do connected to clerical exile. Okay, this is a illustration from an article in a journal issue that I'm editing in Studies in Late Antiquity. Elizabeth is in it as well as Connell. I should say all Clerical Exile is a collaborative project, going also way beyond our little team. So Richard has written about Athanasius and textual communities in Athanasius. And the argument of his article is that Athanasius was basically dealing with communities on two levels. So on one is kind of the community of his readers, who obviously had access to all these things that happened through him, because he was telling them about it, and he's dramatizing certain events, so they feel really part of these kind of dramatic scenes and so on. So that's one level. But the other kind of level of community building in Athanasius is that he writes about communities in a certain way, and he connects people in a certain way. So that's what the article is about. It's kind of resistant literature which puts Athanasius in the middle of this this theological dispute over the Creed of Nicaea, which probably Athanasius wasn't that central, but we think he was central because he writes about it in this way. Okay, so Richard wrote his article, send it to me, I'm the editor, and I thought, okay, that sounds great and so on, but I think we could do some network analysis here. So I said to Richard, do please mine the text for all the characters, put it on an Excel spreadsheet, and I'll write you a network, with not Excel. So poor Richard, went through the whole text, connected everyone with everyone, and so on. And this is the whole network of the history of the Aryans. And obviously, community detection algorithm has identified certain communities in the history of the Aryans, and I should have a bit of the so you have Constantius II and his group, and you have the Arians and the group connected to them, and you have I think the Council of Sardica, which kind of plays a role. Then you have people in Alexandria who are here, and these are the Eusebians, which are actually distinguished from the Arians, quite interestingly, because the Eusebians in Athanasius' story are the kind of his main opponents. And interestingly, Arius, who is the heretic that got the whole theological dispute going, is only down here. And he's not really he's only connected to the Council of Nicaea. So that was one interesting thing, that this guy who gives the name to the history of the Arians isn't actually very central to this story. It's all about between Athanasius and these unnamed Arians and these unnamed Eusebians, who are the followers of Eusebius of Nicomedia. So that's quite interesting. But there are more interesting things in this, because have a look at this. And so amazing, and you do not see this in analog reading. This is the support communities. So when you just look at support communities, and it totally separates the networks into these two groups, one around Athanasius and one around his nemesis, Emperor Constantius II, and there's this group of Eusebians down here who hang on to Constantius II. And Athanasius and Constantius probably never met face to face, but in the text they do face each other. It's all about this, these kind of groups of people, and in the support network they are only linked because actually Constantius does send Athanasius back to Alexandria at some point, and the people of Alexandria are kind of intermediators. So that was just such a as for me, absolute amazing thing that came out of it. And the last thing I want to show you is this one, which is Athanasius' relationship to those bishops that I mentioned earlier: Lucifer, Eusebius of Vercelli, Dionysius of Milan, and Paulinus of Trier. So all these kind of Western bishops who had been exiled on his behalf. We know for a fact that they knew each other. They actually some of them had been at this council of Milan together, so they knew each other even physically. They also exchanged letters. In Athanasius' history of the Arians, they are not connected at all with each other. They're only connected with each other either through Athanasius or through Constantius II. So either through a friend or through an enemy. So obviously they would go through a friend if they want to talk to each other. And that's, it's really a strategy, I think, that Athanasius was adopting to put himself into kind of the middle of these people. The Nicene community, if you want to call them like that, are united around Athanasius, but also can't talk to each other than through Athanasius. And hence he's a key figure of resistance. And I think with that I'll stop. Just wanted to leave you with this this slide on my new project, which is on women, and where we do exactly this to see, how late antique and early medieval authors construct networks, but particularly how they write women into these networks, who are women connected to, because the idea is that often how people talk about women in this field, particularly early medieval, I don't know whether you've come across the term peace weaver, that the one thing that women did was to connect men. They're either some conflict, between men, or they weave peace between them. That's the term from Beowulf. But I thought, and my collaborators thought, that there's probably more to women. So what we're doing is we look at 3 different genres: church history, hagiography, and chronicles. I don't know whether we get to the chronicles. From Eusebius of Caesarea to Bede. We started with Eusebius of Caesarea and Bede, and they both wrote hagiography and church history, and are starting to see some really interesting parallels, but mainly differences, how Bede and Eusebius write about women and who they connect women too. I should say, when I finish with that Bede is the far less sexist person. You know, in terms of Eusebius, I mean, it's very, very interesting. You know, and if you think about kind of conflict and that, you know, that's far more in Eusebius than in Bede. Bede's world, I'm not a medievalist really, but it seems all very peaceful, and everyone is just founding churches and, you know, and patronizing abbots and so on. While obviously in Eusebius a lot of people die, a lot of women die as well. Okay, I'll finish with this, but yeah, there's more to come from Sheffield.